Narnia.org.
Is Narnia what?
Is Narnia.org going the way of the dodo?
It has
Already gone.
It is already gone, and
Okay.
it wasn't our decision. It was done by the owner of the domain. So
We think.
yeah, we think. Anyway, it's disappeared. So and we were trying to keep both of them running at the same time. And then when they saw that we had the new one up, they pulled the plug on Narnia.org. So we got some recovery things to do, but hopefully we can keep the new one up a bit. So please go check the YouTube channel and click subscribe, and tell everybody else you can about the Chronicle, because we hope that by the time the Chronicle's next issue is out, we would have a very large mailing list, because we want this to go national and international. There's no charge to it at this point, and so we want to make sure that it gets out to as many people as possible, to give us not only a bigger audience, but to give us a larger pool of writers. We want everybody to be able to say, this is where you can go and get something published, an article or an idea.
Well,
to read.
I don't know that I would put it quite that way. This is where we want people to go to say, this is where you can go to get a really good article published.
Okay. Yeah, there you go.
We don't want to be so non-discriminating that we put up anything and everything. There's another very large website out there that does that, and you get some ugly stuff.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it's the thought that counts, and it's just among us tonight anyway. So I'd be happy to have any of you submit something. All right. Anything else? Well, let's go ahead and open with our prayer, and then after our prayer, we will take some Lewis sightings, and then we'll get into the meat of our program. So I'm going to share the screen, and I'm going to put up the collect, and good. Okay, that should be. Is that visible? Okay, nod your head.
It is.
Okay.
It is.
John Simmons, would you mind opening our prayer using this collect, please? You're muted.
You're muted, John.
No, he doesn't look muted, but he is. So David Twombly, would you mind just reading the collect for us, please, as a prayer? Can y'all hear him?
I can't.
I can't.
Okay. I don't know what's going on. All right. Who can I hear? Say something.
You can hear me, I'll do it.
Okay, Dennis, if you would.
Let us pray. O God, for as much as without thee we are not able to please thee, mercifully grant that thy Holy Spirit may in all things, it's covered, sorry, in all things direct and true, may in all things direct and rule our hearts through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Okay, figure out what's going on here. All right, everybody unmute yourself. Let's see what's going on. John, I see that you're unmuted, but I cannot hear you.
Matt's unmuted.
Okay.
John, I can't hear you, John.
David, speak.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay,
I hear
yeah.
you now.
I had it set for my for Teams, but I didn't have the default set right for Zoom, so I had to go in there and click the right microphone.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Okay. All right, looks like everybody else is good. John, I still can't hear you. I don't know what's going on. It's the cat must have your tongue.
Trying for it anyway.
Well, I don't know, John. I don't know why you're muted, even though it says you're not. So the American Sign Language will work. So
Keep
any
trying,
Lewis,
John.
any Lewis,
Check your settings.
any Lewis
keep trying.
sightings that we might want to mention, or any of the other inklings?
I had a Lewis sighting in By Faith magazine, which is a publication of the Presbyterian Church in America.
Oh.
It's a long story why I happen to have one. I was flipping through it and I saw you know how they do the where it, sorry. All right, the catch your eye quote in bold print is one of, and I saw the word Lewis, which, you know, always jumps off a page at me. So I looked at the article. The title is Christians Must Play a Part in Binding the Culture's Wounds, a discussion with political analyst David French. Because it's from a political analyst, I haven't even read the article yet. I have no idea who David French is, but he's somehow drawing in the four loves into some political commentary. So I found it interesting, not enough to read it yet, because, you know, political commentators, only thing more worthless is a politician. But
Well, I'm really
interesting.
curious to read it, Andy. French has been in a sort of a debate with another kind of conservative for a couple of years, and it's gotten pretty heated lately. I mean, some people on Twitter are really using bad words. You know, they're just really not being friendly about it.
Okay.
It seems like we've forgotten how to disagree and still be kind to one another all across the socio-political theological spectrum.
All right, thanks for
Well,
that.
Barry, I sent you a clip from a letter sent to the Wall Street Journal, C.S. Lewis on tyranny and conscience. And the writer says, it might offer instruction to those improvers and others to acknowledge the wisdom of C.S. Lewis. He cautioned of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. Those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience.
Wow. And that was where?
That was in the letter section of the Wall Street Journal on October 1st.
That is from the humanitarian theory of
It comes from the humanitarian theory of punishment. Yeah.
punishment. Yeah.
The title the journal gave it was C.S. Lewis on tyranny and conscience.
That doesn't come from Lewis's article. The humanitarian theory of punishment is what he wrote, and it didn't deal with specifically that, but it could be well applied there, I think.
Well, he's just applying it to Biden's vaccine mandate.
All right. Thank you, John. We still can't hear you.
Can't hear me?
Oh, John, we can hear Don. Just can't hear John. You might want to just sign off, sign back in, see if you can see. I don't know what it is, but well, the next thing is, and first of all, any other Lewis sightings? Thank you for doing this. It's always good. Neil Earl did send regrets that he couldn't be here. He said he had a pulled muscle and it makes it difficult for him to sit. So he's not going to join us tonight. Just lift him up in prayer. All right, well, with that, and Dennis, did you want to mention something about the Christianity in the Academy, or just kind of remind everybody it's time to sign up for one of those events if they're going to?
Yeah, Christianity in the Academy. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's a conference that's been held, gosh, how long now, Barry?
Long time
30
now.
years?
Yeah.
At least that, I think. It was originally started by oh, good grief. Bill
Marty.
Marty, thank you. And Bruce Speck,
Larry Lane.
professors at the University of Memphis. And it was designed as a conference to explore the purpose and the stance of Christians working in a non-Christian environment in the academy. It's more than that, but it is at least that. Over the last few years, it's tended to dwindle in membership, and they're trying some things now that are hopefully going to help us build it back up. It has been held in Memphis every year until this year. And this year it's going to be in Jackson, Tennessee, which is about 70 miles east of Memphis. I think they are planning to have it on Zoom. I'm not sure of that, but I think they are. And you can find out more about it by going to the Inklings Fellowship website. Just Google Inklings Fellowship, go to their website, and it's in conjunction with Union University. And then go down and follow the path to their events section, and it'll be listed there. It's going to be in February, isn't it, Barry?
I think so. Yeah.
I don't know the specific date right now, but it's going to be in February, and it's very much worth doing. They're looking for submissions as well. This year, they're dealing with is it the 50th anniversary of the first of Lewis's broadcast talks? I think that's right. And I think that's what they're going to be dealing with.
Okay. Well, anybody that's interested in doing that, and Matt, I think you might really be interested in presenting a paper there, or at least coming and listening. I'm not a presenter, but I am one that likes to listen to those. But it is certainly worthwhile to go and sit and listen to the people have some really interesting presentations. And these are Christian academics that come together and just read papers to one another, and they're just about any topic, even though there are you can talk about things that aren't completely on topic for the year. But if you've got a paper you want to present, it is a good time to do it. So we'd love to have somebody go. If I can make it, I certainly will. All right. Anything else? Anything else for the last bit would be
one other thing relating to Christianity in the Academy. Next summer in July, there's going to be an Inklings Week in Oxford, just the way they have their Inklings Weekend in Montreat every year. Every 3 years, there is an Inklings Week in Oxford, which is a much larger conference / retreat. It's not a conference in the traditional sense. In that everything's usually over by noon, and it gives you a time to actually spend alone and talking to other people there and looking around Oxford. But in conjunction with that 5-day event, there's also going to be a 3-day Christianity in the Academy conference. It's going to be an international conference, and they're taking paper submissions for that as well. So again, you can find that on the Inklings Fellowship website in terms of finding the topics they're going to be dealing with.
good. All right.
And so any of you in the Academy who would like to say you presented a paper at an Oxford conference. Now's your chance.
Yeah, I went into the Bodleian and read a book so that I could say I studied at Oxford, but that was as far as I got.
One more thing, the C.S. Lewis Oxford Society is doing a series of presentations starting October 1st. Dr. Michael Ward will be speaking about the abolition of man. Is it Christian? And October 19th, Alistair McGrath talks about how he discovered C.S. Lewis and what he finds in him as a theologian. And then on the, well, they just had the first two. Wow, what's that?
I thought it was just me, but it's not.
I think it was John. The only thing we heard out of John is static. I don't know what to tell you, John.
Still not hearing you, John. I saw the
Yeah.
mute go away, but still no sound. Sorry.
Yeah, there's a disconnected something in your system. Probably hardware, sounds like.
John, have you closed your computer down and rebooted? Try that.
We'll be here when you get back. So. All right. Well, don't give up, John. All right, folks. Thank you for that, Don and Dennis and everybody else. We hope to see some of you folks at some of these events. Without further ado, we're going to kind of pick up where we left off at our last meeting. This is a two-parter. And the last part, it's all about the sermon on forgiveness that we do not have a transcript of the sermon, but when it was preached, both of these two articles, one out of God in the Dock and the other one out which developed into the chapter on forgiveness and mere Christianity. Both of these are related to the sermon, so that's why we're talking about these articles, this chapter and the essay that was written in that it was published in God in the Dock. They speak in different ways about the topic of forgiveness. I wish we had the sermon, but instead we just noting the sermon and seeing these references. So we decided that last time we would look at one, and tonight we're looking at the other. And we will follow the same format that we have in the past, which is simply to read what Lewis has written and then have a running discussion of that. Again, I invite anybody to stop in the middle of one of the paragraphs. We usually just take turns reading it if you don't have to, but we'll pass it around until the whole thing is read aloud. But you can stop in the middle and ask a question, make a comment, but there will be a pause between each paragraph for us to have a discussion about what's been written. Everybody good with that? And I kind of like this running free for all. I hope that everybody else does too. It's just a good way to do that. So we're all ready. I'll share the screen and I will pull up this article and we will get started. Share the screen. All right, now this is from Mere Christianity, and so that's why it starts off with with a comment about the previous chapter. I'll begin. I don't think I even read last time, but I'll begin, and then you just kind of ready yourself to volunteer to take the next one. I said in a previous chapter that chastity was the most unpopular of the Christian virtues, but I'm not sure I was right. I believe the one I have to talk of today is even more unpopular. The Christian rule, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Because in Christian morals, thy neighbor includes thy enemy. And so we come up against this terrible duty of forgiving our enemies. Everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive, as we had during the war. And then to mention the subject at all is to be greeted with howls of anger. It is not that people think this too high and difficult a virtue. It is that they think it hateful and contemptible. That sort of talk makes me sick, they say. And half of you already want to ask me, I wonder how you'd feel about forgiving the Gestapo if you were a Pole or a Jew. Opening thoughts. Is this a good way to start a sermon? Unless you were preaching to Poles and Jews. You have to.
I doubt seriously he started the sermon that way.
I know.
But I guarantee you he got to this fairly early. But I doubt it was the opening foray.
Well, this is a chapter in Mere Christianity, so it's not exactly the sermon.
Right.
Right.
One of the things I've encountered when I've read narratives and poetry written by people who survived the Holocaust is the question of, that sometimes comes up of, can I forgive? Can I let go of my anger for what was done to me and to other people like me? It's an ongoing theme that's and some of them that survived couldn't, and some of them couldn't make it through their lives because they were overwhelmed with guilt and anger and all of that.
I know all of us have had experiences in our own lives where we've encountered something that was very difficult to forgive. And I'm sure that all of us have been in a position where we've committed some sort of sin where someone else thought that it was very difficult to forgive us. It's a part of being a person on this planet. And I think he's absolutely right when we really have to differentiate between forgiving people that we want to forgive and forgiving people that we don't want to forgive. That requires not only extra work, but it certainly requires the grace of God for that to even be possible. And you all know as well as I do that we can hold on subconsciously, we can hold on to something and not forgive another person, even to the point of not being aware of it. So that we have to have someone call it to our attention that we're not living a life of forgiveness, or that we're still holding a grudge. That's true in my life, and as you'll hear that this was true in Lewis's life as well. So I think he does understand this thing. So this is about forgiving enemies as well as forgiving those that are our neighbors. Anything else? John, I'm sorry, it's not coming through. There's a setting somewhere that's not working. So maybe just type something in the chat. Maybe we can follow that. Someone want to read the next chapter?
I could do it.
All right, if you will.
So do I. I wonder very much. Just as when Christianity tells me that I must not deny my religion, even to save myself from death by torture, I wonder very much what I should do when it came to the point. I am not trying to tell you in this book what I could do. I can do precious little. I am telling you what Christianity is. I did not invent it. And there, right in the middle of it, I find, forgive us our sins as we forgive those that sin against us. There is no slightest suggestion that we are offered forgiveness on any other terms. It is made perfectly clear that if we do not forgive, we shall not be forgiven. There are no two ways about it. What are we to do?
Has that ever haunted you in the Lord's Prayer?
Regularly.
Yeah.
Well, I went through most of my life without making the connection.
Wow.
And then when you make the connection, you're thinking, well, that's not fair. But of
And
course,
the, well, this is not, this is in another book, but in Christian Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset, the main character has just, she just cannot forgive her husband. She's in church. She's having this spiritual experience, but she comes to that part of the Our Father and she cannot say it. And it pretty much destroys their marriage and their life. That she just cannot make herself forgive or even say that line in the Our Father.
What book is this, Jen?
It's Kristen Lavransdatter. It's a medieval. Well, it wasn't written in medieval. It was written by Sigrid Undset, Undset, and it's 3 volumes. It's very long.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, she won the Nobel Prize in Literature, and C.S. Lewis admired her, apparently, or at least her books.
You know, when in a worship service, we use the Apostles' Creed, but we use the Lord's Prayer every Sunday in our church, and I sometimes you just go right over that, and then other times this hits you, just comes right out and hits you, and you kind of connect it to the instructions that we received, that if you're about to have if you're about to come to the table and celebrate the Lord's Supper, and you realize that you got a problem with a brother or sister, that you need to get up and go and solve that problem before you come. And I just wonder if anybody who's ever just been in church looked out in the congregation and somebody comes to the front and then just walks out without taking communion, like, oh, I forgot about this. I got to go deal with this right now. I think that would be an interesting thing for a priest or a pastor to see. I had to leave. I hadn't done what I was supposed to do. All right, who wants to take the next paragraph?
Matt can. I'll read it.
Okay, please, Matt.
It is going to be hard enough anyway, but I think there are 2 things we can do to make it easier. When you start mathematics, you do not begin with the calculus. You begin with simple addition. In the same way, if we really want, but all depends on really wanting to learn how to forgive, perhaps we had better start with something easier than the Gestapo. One might start with forgiving one's husband or wife, or parents or children, or the nearest NCO, for something they have done or said in the last week that will probably keep us busy for the moment. And secondly, we might try to understand exactly what loving your neighbor as yourself means. I have to love him as I love myself. Well, how exactly do I love myself?
All right. You know, as I listen to that, I'm thinking about trying to teach children this whole process. in a very simple way. And just asking them if they could think of something that someone has done that they need to forgive, and then asking them that they do that. And then, okay, now there's one, forgive somebody else. Okay, let's try a third one. Who else would you need to forgive? And just go on down the list, to teach them that you have to sometimes try to think about people who you need to forgive, that you don't just forgive them because they ask, but that you forgive them because it's there to be forgiven. And I wonder, I mean, I like this, what he says. Let's start with the smaller things, not the Gestapo, but the husband or wife, as Janet referred to, or not, or your parents, or your children, or the nearest non-com officer, for something that was simply done or said. Goodness, you're just driving down the street, you end up having to forgive a lot of people now, at least in the city of Memphis. Who was that guy? What did they do? You know, why did they run out there? Why did they push me off the road? I mean, just driving to work should give you plenty of opportunities just to forgive somebody in a smaller way. Anything else about that?
I've always struggled with the idea of the standard that loving neighbor as yourself. I've always preferred to, it's found it easier to look at what John said, has Jesus saying at the Last Supper, that, you know, this is my commandment. You are to love one another as I have loved you. Because that's an easier standard for me to try to understand. Because that is what Lewis is going to go on and say about, you know, love, you know, how exactly do I love myself? I've always like, I'm not even going to try to use that as the standard. I'm going to go with Jesus' standard because it pushes me farther.
Yeah, right.
You know, Barry, this is Matt. I'd like to say something. I apologize for my first and foremost, I'd like to apologize for my video. My internet is unstable and I keep on getting some static here. So, but I do want to, I do want to kind of just clear the air on my thoughts real quick based on that particular portion of it. One, what really set up a foundation for me was the NCO piece. You know, I've spent over 10 years in uniform with the United States Air Force. So, as I was reading this, you know, one, I had a couple of questions. Okay, so was this really geared towards, I mean, he really tried to, you know, relate with those that were at the closest to, you know, let's just say, you know, for lack of better terms, Hell's Gates. And those are combatants. I think, you know, those, we may have a tendency to call them first responders today, or, you know, frontline, you know, individuals that are in hospitals, so on and so forth. But these are people that are in high, you know, high stress situations, things of that nature. So that's how I think of it. The next thing that really set out for me was that, you know, think of one as they attain an educational degree, and once they attain that educational degree, they want to go off and, you know, they can take the world by the reins, and they have, you know, all this immense, you know, thought process, and they can do anything. But I think even me, as you know, one that's gone through the educational attainment, it's not so much that I can take on the world, because my plate can get rather full, but to really sit back and digest, start small, do it in increments, carry on that childlike thing, or that childlike, you know, mindfulness. Can't do one thing at a time, and that's simple for me. And that's just the simplicity of it, and that's how I kind of really reacted to this. And so, yeah, very cool stuff. Thank you.
Well, you know, you mentioned that about being in the military. I've never been in the military, but I understand what he was saying. Lewis was in the military. Plus, he was writing to people who were listening at this time in the radio broadcast, who had a part of this in their everyday life. A lot of people, a lot more than normal, because it was in the middle of the war. But I mean, we could easily go to just about any industry and say this. where might be talking about the supervisor at work. We might be talking about the bossy person who works next to us in a factory line, or it could be someone who was in even academics who was making you jump through hoops as a student that you didn't necessarily have to go through, or just anybody, your snipping neighbor for that point. So I really get that, and I'm glad that that NCO part really registered with you, Matt. But I guess all of us could come up with something like that that we work with. I mean, if you worked in a restaurant, you've always got the customer who is just jabbing at you all the time because you weren't quick enough with the drinks, or you didn't wipe off the table, or you didn't come back and ask if they needed more water. I mean, it could just be anybody at any time, and I guess that's pretty good advice for me as like. It's whoever it is, who's in front of you that needs to be forgiven. I mean, as I sit here in my study tonight, neighbors on the back of us across the alley, they got their music up so loud I can hear it, and I'm having to say, "Oh my goodness, let me forgive them for doing that." It's not my kind of music anyway, so I just have to turn up the fan real loud and say, "Lord, forgive them, for they obviously do not know what they're doing." Because they're playing that weird music. But I mean, that's just part of that. And then you get that part that says love your neighbor as yourself. And I'm thinking, well, if I like my music up, I'm going to play Little Doobie Brothers and turn that up loud. What about the guy next door who prefers country music and really doesn't like the Doobies? And I'm going to go, well, to love my neighbor as myself means I either need to turn my music down or be tolerant of theirs. So in the smallest way, I think that's where we see that. Thank you for the comment, Matt. Anything else?
I think there's something more going on than just the obvious here. In much of Lewis's writing, he'll write about something, and the purpose is to show you how far short you fall. Not just you, but everyone. People as a whole fall short. And in his fiction, he does the same thing. And in the end, it all points to the idea that we're incapable of doing any of this without partaking in the nature of God himself. Does that make any sense to anybody?
Yep.
Paul Little wrote a book a long time ago. I don't even remember what it was called, but in it he was talking about people being good people or bad people. And he said, let's assume that you're not talking about good and bad. Let's assume you're talking about swimming skills. He said, suppose you're standing on the dock in San Francisco and you decide you want to swim to Hawaii. He said, some people are going to jump in and they're going to drown right at the edge of the dock because they can't swim. Other people are going to get further and further away, and you may find some great swimmer who swum 100 or 200 or even 300 miles out. But in the end, what's the difference in terms of Hawaii? So, and Lewis deals with the same thing in another place in Mere Christianity, in the chapter called I can't remember what the title of the chapter is, but he's referring to two characters, Dick Firkin and Miss Bates. One of them who is a wonderful person in human standards, the other of whom is just someone nobody ever really wants to be around. And yet that person becomes a Christian, and the one who is pretty well self-reliant as a human never does. Well, in the end, no matter how good you are as a human, you fail. And so to Miss Bates, he says, don't worry about comparing yourself to Dick. Compare yourself to yourself. How are you today as opposed to the way you were yesterday? And how are you tomorrow as opposed to the way you were yesterday? Because in the end, we have all this life until your death, and from then all eternity to make you perfect. And the same thing is true. I mean, everything I see Lewis writing, and this brings it home about as well as anything. His focus is always on the fact that we cannot do this on our own. Some people will be better than others, but in the end, we will all fail. I will now shut up.
Well, it's a good point. Appropriate for the discussion. Yeah, and I think you're right, Dennis. There is something that's underlying that besides just the surface stuff. But again, this is, when he says start simple, I think that's the simplest place that we can start. And then later we learn that there's a lot more under that we find beneath the surface of the simplest things. And I think that's true with the whole of our faith, that we move deeper down, and as long as we mature, we will continue to find layers underneath that, mature layers. Yeah, Janet.
Well, just this whole idea of loving your neighbor as yourself, loving yourself, that is talk about layers. That's so complex, that it's almost impossible to figure out what that would mean. Because you think about loving yourself, a lot of people say they don't love themselves, but in the end, they're going to preserve their life, and they're going to, I don't know. It's just even not loving yourself is in some ways a way of loving yourself. It's just very complex. But anyway, in the next paragraph, I think Lewis explains at least what he thinks that means.
Well, speaking of that, you want to read the next paragraph? I
will do it.
Please.
Hey, John just put a question up a minute ago. I don't see it now, but he was asking, what about forgiving yourself? How does that enter into this, or does it?
John, can you hold on to that question to the end, and let's kind of pick it up at the end to see if it rolls itself out for us. Okay, please don't let us forget. Janet?
Okay. Now that I come to think of it, I have not exactly got a feeling of fondness or affection for myself, and I do not even always enjoy my own society. So apparently, love your neighbor does not mean feel fond of him or find him attractive. I ought to have seen that before, because of course you cannot feel fond of a person by trying. Do I think well of myself, think myself a nice chap? Well, I'm afraid I sometimes do. And those are no doubt my worst moments. But that is not why I love myself. In fact, it is the other way around. My self-love makes me think myself nice, but thinking myself nice is not why I love myself. So loving my enemies does not apparently mean thinking them nice either. That is an enormous relief. For a good many people imagine that forgiving your enemies means making out that they are really not such bad fellows after all, when it is quite plain that they are. Go a step further. In my most clear-sighted moments, not only do I not think myself a nice man, but I know that I'm a very nasty one. I can look at some of the things I have done with horror and loathing. So apparently I am allowed to loathe and hate some of the things my enemies do. Now that I come to think of it, I remember Christian teachers telling me long ago that I must hate a bad man's actions, but not hate the bad man. Or as they would say, hate the sin, but not the sinner.
Okay, that's a pretty common statement these days.
It gets dismissed really easily too.
Yes,
people.
it really does. It really does. Any comments there? I mean, I've got a couple of things that kind of hit me. Anybody else want to open?
that last piece. So again, I am just, as I've, read through this is Matt again, just drawing conclusions and trying to be synonymous with a couple of things. I try to look at it as objective as possible. But that last piece, as far as don't hate, don't hate the sinner, hate the sin. I think we had, and not to, we had a very, very courageous Supreme Court justice that also had something in terms of, don't attack the person, attack the idea. And so that resonated with me, and that's how I look at it. And so again, I am learning, and you guys are are teaching me, because I am in my infancy with this journey, with C.S. Lewis and his inspiration, so that's just how I take that, and so just trying to plug it into my own reality here, and so anyway, that's Matt speaking.
Yeah, I get that, and that's one of the things that kind of triggers me to think about the times that I work downtown with our homeless friends, and anytime you get a group of homeless people, and David works with me, and David Twombly is one of our volunteers as well. But anytime you get a bunch of homeless people together, you've obviously got a variety, just like in any other group of people, but you got a variety of folks who are not easy to like. Even in the middle of that, you've got a lot of homeless people who are very easy to like, and we do. I mean, some of those guys that I have known for now 11 years that I've been working with, feeding on Tuesdays. Some of those guys are just as nasty as they were the day that I met them. The language is harsh, their behavior is harsh, their attitude toward other people, toward women, toward people of another race. You sometimes see that, the language that they use, and yet we keep feeding them, because if you make the judgment over at looking at a group of people who are in need, and you make the judgment, you look like you're a good guy, you look like you've had a long, hard life, but it's probably not your fault. You've been dealing with drugs. You've grown up in a family that was harsh, and you want to make the decision. You deserve a handout. You don't, because this is obviously your fault. The way you behave, the things you think, your choices that you've made, and I think what I get out of this is that when you see those folks, you have to suddenly say, all of these people are not only made in the image of God, all of these people should be loved as they are. And because they are God's children, and they are my brothers and sisters in creation. So my job is to feed them. But some of these people are really hard to like because of what they do and say that grinds me the wrong way. Yet my responsibility as a Christian is to continue to feed them. And that ends up being this version of love. So love ends up being handing the food, giving them a pair of pants, giving them a sleeping bag, sitting down and having a conversation with them, even though you may be cussed out today. The next time it might not be that way. So that's kind of forgetting the actions. That's just kind of a responsibility that I think we have as Christians, and it's a hard thing to do. And then you look at yourself. Let's say they push me. Fortunately, this has not happened. But let's say some of these people push me so far with their language or their behavior or their attitude, and I lose my cool. And I'm thinking, well, that's certainly, number one, it's not a good witness. And number two, I would say I have not loved them as I love myself, because my pushing has been worse than theirs. So I would say to myself, I had a reason to do that. I had a reason to lose my cool. I had a reason. I'm justified. But the truth is, I'm not. So I don't have that. I won't say call it a luxury, but you understand what I mean. I don't have the luxury of just letting go, because I want to love them the way that I should love myself, which is tolerate that feeling. Let's deal with that. So that's kind of where that hits me, Matt, in a real life scenario with folks.
Powerful, Barry. That is real. I'm sorry. That is very powerful. Thank you.
This is Marion, and I'm a little hesitant to speak because I've come here so rarely, and I'm afraid I'll say something that you've already hashed over or whatever. But the reason I showed up tonight is that when I got Barry's email, I have just picked up Mere Christianity in the last few days again. And for the first time, it's really speaking to me. I think the other times I tried to read it, I don't know, for some reason I wasn't getting it. So, but I wanted to bring out one other point about forgiveness that may not have been mentioned. And I've, through my readings and through my self-work, I've run across the idea that by not forgiving someone, you allow that person to have power over you in the sense of your feelings. And, letting, by forgiving and letting go of that, you are in charge of your own behavior and your own emotions. And it's not easy. And what made me think of that was when Dennis brought in that a supreme being is very important in this. And that's where supreme being does come up in. It would be easier if someone apologizes, but there are situations where you never get an apology because they don't think they've done anything wrong. But just not giving them the authority over you can be very freeing. So thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here tonight.
Well, we're delighted that you're here, Marianne, and you can speak anytime. I guarantee you, no matter what you say, we can sound like we don't know what we're saying either. So so it's okay. We're not experts by any means. We're all fellow journeyers.
Equally important to that is she brought up something that we have rarely, if ever, actually brought up before. We've been at this for 26 years and have done Mere Christianity now how many times, Barry?
I don't know, a lot.
Three or four. And I don't think anybody's ever brought up that aspect to it. And that's an excellent point.
It is.
Because it's absolutely true. Lewis does at times discuss the fact that when we claim to have power over nature, people never really have power over nature. All you have is some people having power over other people. And that's exactly the point you brought up, Marion. So thank you.
Well, and I think there's some real value in forgiving a person who doesn't ask to be forgiven. And they may be completely frustrated or worried or angry. They may not even know that they have violated us. And yet if we forgive them, it changes our whole attitude. I mean, if I've forgiven someone, I don't have any reason to treat them any differently. It's over. It's forgotten. And I think we probably always been in a position somewhere along in our lives, we've been in a position where we were worried about something and that we had done or said. And then when we finally got up the nerve to say, I need you to forgive me for what I said, and that person has no recollection whatsoever of what you've done. And you're just going, I've been worried so much about this, and they didn't even hear me. They didn't even know I'd done it. So I think that's a great thing. It's like understanding that God really truly doesn't remember things that we have done that are forgiven. That's a hard thing to accept. We recall it, but God said, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. And that's a God that forgives. So
I was going to say about that last line, hate the sin, but not the sinner. two things always come up to my mind when I hear that expression. One of them is I'm always concerned that if I, hate the sin, am I hating it because it bothers me, it offends me, or am I hating it because it is something that God has prohibited that the person has done? And the other thing is, I've seen too many situations in recent years where people use this expression and then use the sin against that person, even though they claim to have forgiven. But they use that sin. They keep reminding that person of the sin that they have forgiven that person of, which is not really hating the sin. It's like using this sin as a weapon against the sinner. And I see that in church situations, which makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I think that's not what Lewis at all has in mind with this expression, but I think that's how sometimes today people have used it.
Well, you're absolutely right, Charles. I know that just this last week, as I was reading from Oswald Chambers, he just reminded me in a way that just kind of slapped me in the face, because I had never, or if I had thought about it, it had not stuck with me, but that Christ came to forgive sin, and we continue to understand that as the individual sins that we commit. And if we become very specific with what is a sin, one act of disobedience or missing the mark, or however you're going to define it, then we can spend all of our time arguing about the definition of one sin after another, where Christ came to forgive sin. That's sin that we've inherited, that it's hereditary sin, the sin of humanity. And we get focused on the small sins where God came to forgive human sin. And that really hit me this last week when I read that. It's like, I'm glad that Chambers decided to differentiate between that word. And I think there are sins that make up human sinfulness, but that Christ covered it all, regardless of how we define the individual sins. God sees us as sinful, and it's an inherited thing that we've inherited from one man, as the scripture would tell us, and through one man our sin was forgiven. All right, anything else? We'll move to the next paragraph.
I
John
can read
had
the
a
next.
comment in chat.
Okay, I can't see it on my screen, so somebody read it.
This is John's words during his vow of silence, involuntary vow of silence. A problem I have is that I can't forget that I once allowed myself to be bullied by someone instead of standing up to him. It makes it hard to forgive him because it is hard to forgive myself for my reaction to him.
I think I understand what you're saying, John. Anybody else want to add to that? Just want to respond to John's confession, maybe. Don, you're muted.
I'm not sure that this is what John is saying, but I just wonder if part of that is not being mad at himself for taking it. I would be.
I think that's exactly what he's saying. Yeah, and I agree. And forgiving yourself can be the hardest thing of all. I mean, it absolutely can. I can't tell you the number of people I've apologized for something years later, and I've finally gotten up enough nerve to go apologize to them, and they're going, I never thought about it. but I mean, they didn't even know that they didn't forgive me because they felt no need to forgive anything. And yet I found a great deal of difficulty forgiving myself. Even things that were done unintentionally that caused somebody problems. And I bet I'm not alone in that.
You know, I had a friend who was a minister. I won't even give you any hint about who it was, but he came into my office one day and he said, um, he closed the door, which is always a sign, you know, when somebody closes the door. And he said, I have broken all 10 of the commandments. And then he proceeded to tell me how he had failed on every one of those. And I sit there because I didn't know, things were not obvious. I didn't know much about it. And he really had. He had done all 10 of the commandments. And he said, and when I realized that I had not even managed to keep one, I said, there's no hope. I have no standing in front of God. Um, the only thing I can do is depend upon God's grace, because there's not one thing that I can possibly go to God and say, I'm okay at this point. And I understood it. He was at peace. He was at peace because that brokenness of confession to himself, and he didn't have to tell me any of this. I didn't ask, but that brokenness and that confession to himself was what placed him in the position of receiving mercy and grace from God, where he had nothing else to lose. And I recall that meeting, um, not with disappointment. I mean, it disappoints me to hear anybody who's made choices and they've gone away from God. No anger, and the disappointment would have been for him, rather than from his violation of any of the commandments. It was for him because all of the things that he had done, he had moved beyond in time, and not only in time, he had all those things had healed in one way or another. But I mean, the person that was killed was buried. Uh, he had made payments of some sort to the family. He had made up with his wife. He had repaid things that he had taken. All of those things were paid for at one level. But what he still hung on to was the fact that he had broken all of the commandments, that he had committed those sins. He was the only one. He was the last one to need to forgive anyone. And when he said, when I realized I was totally, totally empty and I had nothing left, and I said, the only way that I can be okay is to give myself completely to God. In doing that, he was able to move beyond the breaking of any of those laws and the commitment of any of those sins. It was a very moving experience to listen to him say that. He's no longer alive, so I know that he was okay before he died. He had not only made peace, but he had finally, because of his complete emptiness, he had no choice but to forgive himself and get beyond it. It was being empty that allowed him to do that. I don't know if that helps how this feels at all, John, or about any of us forgiving ourselves. But if that's the last thing that we have to do, I think we do that out of pure need. It's like there is no solution. I'm at the bottom, and as I said in the sermon a couple of weeks ago, when you're at the bottom, you realize that God's down there with you. And even when you're at the bottom with God, you find that the God is still below the bottom. He's still below there, holding you up. And that's where he was. And I think that's how we all have to do with looking at ourselves and our own sinfulness. But enough preaching. Anybody else?
I'm not sure this is exactly applicable, but the lectionary reading for today, the gospel reading was Mark 10, the story of the rich young ruler. And something that really caught my eye when I began to drill down into it was that, and only Mark records this, says that Jesus loved this guy, this rich young ruler. And the Greek word was agape.
Yeah. Well,
And yet he let him go away. That is a kind of forgiveness, I guess.
Well, I think I've said this here before. We just assume that it means that he went away and never came back.
Yeah.
It just meant that he was just sad. Like I've said before, God asked me to do things and they make me sad, and I have to think about them before I do them. And sometimes it takes me a while, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to do them. But it's funny, Don, because that was the first time that I had noticed that phrase too. That really jumped out at me in church today.
you said, and Jesus loved him. Yeah. Yeah. It's like its own little phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our translation was Jesus looked at him with love.
I think if I remember right, on George MacDonald's sermon on that episode in the Gospels, that George MacDonald argued that the man came back. The man did go away and do what Jesus commanded. That was MacDonald's belief anyway.
I think you're right about that, Charles. That sounds very much like MacDonald anyway. That's MacDonald's way of thinking. Well, good point, Don. I appreciate you bringing that out. All right. Who wants to read the next paragraph?
I can read the next one.
Okay, Bill.
For a long time, I used to think this was a silly, straw-splitting distinction. How could you hate what a man did and not hate the man? But years later, it occurred to me that there was one man to whom I had been doing this all my life, namely myself. However much I might dislike my own cowardice or conceit or greed, I went on loving myself. There had never been the slightest difficulty about it. In fact, the very reason why I hated the things was that I loved the man. Just because I loved myself, I was sorry to find that I was the sort of man who did those things. Consequently, Christianity does not want us to reduce by one atom the hatred we feel for cruelty and treachery. We ought to hate them. Not one word of what we have said about them needs to be unsaid. But it does want us to hate them in the same way in which we hate things in ourselves, being sorry that the man should have done such things and hoping, if it is any way possible, that somehow, sometime, somewhere, he can be cured and made human again.
Yeah. Yeah, that's there again, Charles. That's exactly what MacDonald would have said. If there's any way possible. Yeah, isn't it true that whenever when we just feel completely by ourselves and alone, we still have this conversation with ourselves? That kind of, it's just you and me now. Don't you feel bad? Don't you feel good? Aren't you glad that helped or that didn't help? We hardly ever say, well, you idiot, and really mean it. Because as soon as we say you idiot, they say, well, you're okay. Don't worry, you'll be all right. And we're just talking to ourselves. Any other comment about this this paragraph?
Barry, this is Matt. I just want to chime in. I can't thank you enough for you guys reading this that one piece again, because it truly resonates. So, as somebody that's, let's just call myself an outsider looking in, as far as reading C.S. Lewis through a much wider scope and a much deeper depth, is in fact, and this is just my question here based on that, could this be aimed at some of that stuff? Could it be aimed at towards me as I'm reading it? I'm reading this to myself. Am I on? We've heard the term, we are our own worst enemy. Should I be cognizant of that? Dennis brought it up, looking past the obvious, knowing that we're not in this alone, and giving it all, and knowing and just giving it all up, and just letting Jesus have it. So is it this in fact, and this is just my question, is mere Christianity and how I read it and how it, I'm deducing the information down, is this aimed at an individual, at me, to realize, hey, that before one can go off and do anything, and even for begin, it starts with oneself, and looking into oneself and knowing that there is a higher being, and that's the Jesus and God and the Christianity, or is my logic faulty there? Anyway, that's just how I've got a lot. This is some good stuff. I've got a lot of questions, and this is some powerful stuff.
Well, and Matt, my first response is that this information is true for the whole of humanity. And yet when the Holy Spirit interacts with us, as we engage this, it becomes very, very personal. So that we finally find ourselves in the story. The story is there, the story is true, the story is eternal, and yet it's not real or not useful to us as human beings until the Holy Spirit makes us engage with this individually on a one-on-one basis. So, and that's how I see that. I mean, that's certainly my encounter. I mean, anybody can pick up the Bible and read it and it not work until like nothing happens. You don't get anything out of it. And then one day, one verse, one word, one phrase will be what breaks into your life. And from there, it begins to work. And it's because it's finally become personal. It's become your story instead of a story that you read about other people. And I think that's what I observe. And as a pastor, I think my job is to apply the story that's happened to me in my encounter with the big story, as Larry Crabb would say, the larger story, and then tell other people about it, do my best to lead them to the place that happens with them. It's not my job to make it happen, but it's my job to introduce that to them so that that story can find a way into their heart at that level. So yeah, I think it is just written to you, Matt, but it's written to all of us as human beings, creatures in this world. Other comments about that?
I wonder how much it changed between the actual oral presentation and what he wrote later on. Because if you think about the broadcast talks, that was directed primarily, I think, to a group. Because in those days, in the 40s, people would gather around the radio to listen to it. Family or friends or whatever. It wasn't primarily an individual type of experience, but I don't know, that might be just wind.
So you don't think that the people gathered around the radio would have said, now let's break up into small groups now?
Don't think that happened.
I don't think it did either.
No, but
But my original point is that this is not addressed really to individuals, but to groups of people.
Well, it is the same thing as preaching. Yeah. So that you do preach the sermon to the congregation, and you pray that the Spirit will take the message and apply it to any person who hears it. But you know that just the preaching of the sermon is not what this is about. It's never
Yeah,
getting the message out. It's getting the message into someone.
It's happened to me about twice, I believe, that someone will come up to me and say that what you said and tell me what it was really affected me. And I knew I had not said that particular thing
That's it.
in the sermon.
It's the strange
Spirit.
preaching.
Yeah.
Experience of preaching.
Strange preaching.
What you say is not what the Spirit does with it. And
That's right.
and the weird part is it's just none of your business what the Spirit does with it as the preacher.
And I gave a talk one time and a man came and told me that I had changed his life by something I said. And he kept talking about it. And when he finally explained it to me, not only did I not remember saying what he was talking about, it was something I absolutely did not believe was true. But, there was just really nothing I could do but just kind of nod my head and go, well, okay.
Yeah.
So,
And say thank you.
Yeah.
yeah.
Gotta say, if I had someone do that to me, I think my first thought would be, don't blame me with this.
Yeah. That sounds an awful lot like some of those Old Testament prophets who said, I'm sorry, but this is what God told me to do, and I have no choice. I just got to tell you. So,
And you saw how that worked out.
yeah, every time
Yep, pretty much.
they ignore the message and kill the prophet. Thank you. All right, good. Let's go to the next one. Who wants to read the next one?
I can do that.
All right, Don.
The real test is this. Suppose one reads a story of filthy atrocities in the paper. Then suppose that something turns up suggesting that the story might not be quite true, or not quite so bad as it was made out. Is one's first feeling, thank God, even they aren't quite so bad as that? Or is it a feeling of disappointment and even a determination to cling to the first story for the sheer pleasure of thinking your enemy is as bad as possible? Boy, if this isn't current. If it is the second, then it is, I'm afraid, the first step in a process, which, if followed to the end, will make us into devils. You see, one is beginning to wish that black was a little blacker. If we give that wish its head, later on we shall wish to see gray as black, and then to see white itself as black. Finally, we shall insist on seeing everything, God and our friends and ourselves included, as bad, and not be able to stop doing it. We shall be fixed forever in a universe of pure hatred.
Whoa, he got you this time. Sounds pretty up to date, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
John Simmons just wrote that it sounds like the denizens of hell in the Great Divorce.
Oh, yeah.
And it does. And it sounds like the end of mere Christianity. Because when you get into that fourth book, he's talking about the solution to all of this and everything else he's written about in the first three parts.
I was briefly at my sister's house this afternoon, and they were listening to Fox News. I believe that's all they listened to. But the panel was discussing things in such a vituperative manner. Let's hate this guy for doing this. Let's hate that girl for doing that. And I just had to get up and leave. I couldn't take it. I did not tell my sister that, but I just had to leave because they're doubting the reports. They're doubting the news is accurate, even though it's coming from a reputable source. It's what Lewis is talking about here. We find ourselves in a universe of pure hatred.
Well, and one of the things I observed, living near New York City at the time, around 9/11, how many people, even at Nyack where I was, which was a Christian college, there were some of us like myself who were deeply grieving and sorrowing for all that had happened and all the lives that were lost. And there were other people who were walking around with anger and rage and like, and wanted to go off and do something and like go and hurt somebody because they were that angry. And one of the professors, who was actually an expert in Islam, had to get up in front of the community and the college community and say, "Hold on, this is really what," and explain what was going on. But even then, there were still some people who went and harassed some Sikh men who ran a convenience store around the corner from the school, which was, the Sikhs had nothing to do with what happened.
Oh, yeah.
But it was something that surprised me because I had not seen that kind of thing in a Christian community, that kind of anger. Instead of the response of sorrow or our first thing to pray about, but people wanting to do some kind of anger, express some kind of anger.
Well,
And
Charles, I certainly see that in theological education these days, where there is a drive to activism, not for the sake of Christ, but for the sake of satisfying whatever that angst is that you've just described. That if you can somehow attach your faith to your anger, instead of letting faith drive you to peace and forgiveness and grace, it becomes a different animal altogether. It's like Lewis says here, one is beginning to wish that black was a little blacker. I mean, that's a fascinating statement to me. And then you begin to wish gray was black, and then that white was black, and you get it reversed, and what you think is getting you more involved in something is actually pulling you out of something as the faith. So anger ends up being the controlling the controlling factor. So you've got anger dressed as Christianity, and you started off with Christianity dressed as anger, and it's a problem. I mean, a recognized problem that Lewis is warning us about it, and we're seeing it played out daily.
Barry and Charles, I will, Matt again here. I'd like to make a brief comment on that right there. Barry, you talked about the anger, and Charles brought it up too. That anger was what I experienced at 19 years old on September 11th, 2001. By December the 4th of 2001, I was enlisted in the United States Air Force. So that event impacted me and compelled me to answer a call. Now, to be a 19-year-old kid, sure, I received Christ at 13 years old, went through my teenage years, went through that rebellious stage. But that single event was what prompted me to go and sign that blank check. And so, sure, as a man that's approaching 40 years old, and going through maturation and looking at this and through a hindsight, my seventh great grandfather, Robert Barclay, many of you who are theologians know that name, would probably roll in his grave at the fact that, I didn't approach that with the idea of friends, instead, that's exactly what I did. I enlisted in the United States military. And you know what? It's something that I would do again. I would do it again. I wouldn't
for the same reason, Matt, for the same reason.
Yeah, I felt like what I was doing was something good, was to go and try to help protect others. Now that may be naive thinking. And of course, like I said, I will sit down and have a cup of coffee because I want to learn from you guys as much as anything, because I do know killing is not the way to go about it. But
we're doing, I would say you were doing something constructive that, trying, as you understood it, to respond, to serve your country. And that's a different thing from, like a few of the students at my college who went around to the convenience store and harassed a couple of men they thought were Arabs who happened to be Sikhs.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Okay.
There's a big difference between doing something that's going to serve your country in response.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. Okay.
And don't be too quick to give in to all the pacifists in the world that say you can't be Christian unless you're a pacifist.
C.S.
Okay.
Lewis, military in World War I.
And he did more than his share in World War II, as those of you who read the second volume of Hal Poe's biography will discover. Hal discovered a 78 speed record being sold in Iceland on eBay that had to do with Lewis giving a talk about the Norse influence in English literature, I think it was. And it's something that was commissioned by MI6 in World War II. Germany had conquered Norway, which was sort of like to Iceland what the United States is to Hawaii. Iceland was a part of it. It was just off somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, of the North Atlantic. And to prevent the Germans from conquering Iceland, which was the normal next step of, according to what they'd been doing, England invaded Norway. And they asked Lewis to create and to produce something that would explain to the Icelandic people why they were there, and to let them know that they weren't invading just for the sake of invading, that there was a qualitative difference between what they were doing and what the Germans were trying to do. And so Lewis created this 2-disc speech, and they shipped it to Norway and played it over the Norwegian airwaves.
You mean Iceland?
I mean, Iceland, yes, I'm sorry, thank you. But anyway, there's in the middle of that book, there's a section several pages long describing that process and what it was. So Lewis not only participated in World War I as a combatant, he also played a large role behind the scenes in World War II. And he wrote a thing that says, "Why I'm not a pacifist."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I'm not trying to say that you can't be a pacifist and be a Christian at the same time. What I'm saying is that those people who are pacifists, who want to claim that you can't be a Christian and a non-pacifist at the same time, have just missed the point. So a lot of it depends on the motivation. Matt talked about his motivation for doing it. Yes, even if the people in that corner market had not been Sikhs, suppose they had been any other form of
if they've been Muslim.
If Muslim, yeah. If they weren't directly involved in doing it, if they didn't come out and start cheering because it had been done, showing their approval, you've got no right attacking those people. I mean, Christians can't do that kind of thing. Not in call it a Christian act. But to defend your nation, to defend other people, to prevent this from happening again, if you decided to join the military, I don't think anybody's got a big kick about that. And one of the things that you can be sure it has done is it has shaped the direction of your life in a way that you would have never believed possible before you joined the military.
Well, anyway, and thank you for your comments. I am going to call point of order for the day and let us move on so that we can finish the next page.
Well, it's a good idea. And by the way, when I said don't let pacifists tell you can't do this, I wasn't necessarily pointing at anybody here. I mean, people here, you're going to find a wide range of beliefs here. But just in the world in general, there are a lot of people out there ready to say, you can't be a Christian if you do this, and you can't be a Christian if you do that. Christianity at its core has nothing to do with any of those other things. It has to do not with what you do, but with what you have become and what you are becoming.
All right, do we have a volunteer for the next paragraph?
I'll do it.
Okay, David.
All right.
Thanks,
Now
Sean.
now a step further. Does loving your enemy mean not punishing him? No, for loving myself does not mean that I ought not to subject myself to punishment, even to death. If one had committed a murder, the right Christian thing to do would be to give yourself up to the police and be hanged. It is therefore, in my opinion, perfectly right for a Christian to judge to sentence a man to death, or a Christian soldier to kill an enemy. I have always thought so, ever since I became a Christian, and long before the war, and I still think so now that we are at peace. It is no good quoting, "Thou shalt not kill." There are two Greek words, the ordinary word to kill and the word to murder. And when Christ quotes that commandment, he uses the murder one in all three accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I am told there is the same distinction in Hebrew. All killing is not murder any more than all sexual intercourse is adultery. When soldiers came to St. John the Baptist asking what to do, he never remotely suggested that they ought to leave the army, nor did Christ when he met a Roman sergeant major, what they call a centurion. The idea of the knight, the Christian in arms for the defense of a good cause, is one of the great Christian ideas. War is a dreadful thing, and I can respect an honest pacifist, though I think he is entirely mistaken. What I cannot understand is this sort of semi-pacifism you get nowadays, which gives people the idea that though you have to fight, you ought to do it with a long face and as if you are ashamed of it. It is that feeling that robs lots of magnificent young Christians in the services of something they have a right to, something which is the natural accompaniment of courage, a kind of gaiety and wholeheartedness.
You know, the thing that hits me as this was written probably 10 years before, 10 or 11 years before Joy Davidman Lewis wrote Smoke on the Mountain, her book on the 10 Commandments. And his comment about the two Greek words to kill and to murder seems like it came up in her book, and she did such a good job of doing that. But it seems like here's another connection between what Joy wrote and what Lewis wrote. I'm sure they discussed that at great length before she wrote that. So any other comments? All right, right Christian thing would be to do is give yourself up to the police and be hanged. Next paragraph. No one took that for a bait. Okay. Next paragraph. Who would want to read that one? I have often thought.
I can do it, Barry.
Okay, Chuck.
I've often thought to myself how it would have been if, when I served in the First World War, I and some young German had killed each other simultaneously and found ourselves together a moment after death. I cannot imagine that either of us would have felt any resentment or even any embarrassment. I think we might have laughed over it.
You got that picture in your head, though. I mean, don't you? You can just see that. It seems like I've seen that in a movie somewhere. Dennis would probably remember a movie somewhere where two guys shot each other at the same time in combat.
You're muted, Dennis.
Yeah, it sounds like a Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah.
I mean, it does.
Yeah.
But yeah, that would be I think Lewis is very astute with that. I think there's very little actual hatred between soldiers in a battle. I think there's probably more fear than anything. But I can't imagine you actually hating the person that you're fighting against. It's too, I don't know how to describe it. It's a battle is too impersonal for that in some ways.
In today's, and I promise you I'll be brief, 'cause I know Barry, we're stretching on our time here, but so Dennis, yeah, you hit it. You know, fear is often a big thing. And if you've ever heard Oliver North, you know, when the chaplains come out and we're getting ready to rock and roll, you know, that's a very, very real thing to have other members of the military to sit and pray, knowing that, you know, that could be our very last prayer or whatever, what have you. And I think you're correct. I know for me, in times of anguish and times of stress, and that's comparable to battle. For me, it was more so, you know, the objective. Focus on the objective, and what are the constraints to that objective. And I've got somebody that's obviously, you know, their objective is to take me out, and my objective is to, you know, do the same to meet my objective. And so that's really what it is. And there, you're correct. Do I hate that other man? But no, there's no real hate. I don't know that other guy. Well, the only thing that can be painted a picture of is a hatred towards the idea of what that individual, you know, believes in. We are taught, you know, to dehumanize, and that's to produce what the military produces, and that's trained weapons. And so that's just Matt commenting on.
There is a John Wayne movie called The Unforgiven with Rock Hudson and the cast of characters that always follows John Wayne around in all of his movies. But there is a scene in which they're having to make a choice about whether to help a group of Southern soldiers. Wayne's crew were in the North, fighting for the North. It's after the war's over. Now they've got to decide whether to help this group who had fought for the South. And one of them, in giving his opinion, says, "John Henry, you remember when I told you that story back at Pittsburgh Landing where I was hiding behind the log and all the rebels had all taken off after you guys, and there was just one guy there without a gun that's just clinging to me almost. It's one little rebel fella." And he says, "Yeah, well, what's that have to do with here?" He says, "Well, don't you remember what he told me? He told me that he wanted to give himself up, and I said, 'Get on out of here. I got no use for you.' And his response was, 'Well, you got me whether you want me or not.'" And there's a great deal of that. And I think what Lewis was saying here. You know, you wouldn't hate the guy. Even when you meet him in life, you still don't hate him. You're just on opposing sides. I would say there was more hatred after the Civil War. I'd say there was more hatred went on then than during the actual war.
All right, any other comments?
Dennis reminded me of another movie, the great opening speech of Patton, where he says it's your duty, and I'll leave out the profanity, but he says it's your duty to make the other guy die for his country, not for you to die for yours.
Yeah.
And that sort of sums up what the duty of any soldier is, I guess.
Okay, let's get to the next paragraph, starting with I imagine somebody will say, who wants to go over there? Who hasn't read? Or you can read again.
I'll read it.
Okay, Dennis.
I imagine someone will say, well, if one is allowed to, hang on, I'm having trouble reading. If one is allowed to condemn the enemy's acts and punish him and kill him, what difference is left between Christian morality and the ordinary few? All the difference in the world. Remember, we Christians think man lives forever. Therefore, what really matters is those little marks or twists on the central inside part of the soul, which we are going to turn it. Did I skip a line?
Nope.
No,
No,
go ahead.
okay. Which we are going to turn it in the long run. Okay. Into a heavenly or a hellish creature. Thank you, Barry. We may kill if necessary, but we must not hate and enjoy hating. We may punish if necessary, but we must not enjoy it. In other words, something inside us, the feeling of resentment, the feeling that wants to get one's own back, must be simply killed. I do not mean that anyone can decide this moment that he will never feel it anymore. That is not how things happen. I mean that every time it bobs its head up, day after day, year after year, all our lives long, we must hit it on the head. It is hard work, but the attempt is not impossible. Even while we kill and punish, we must try to feel about the enemy as we feel about ourselves, to wish that he were not bad, to hope that he may, in this world or another, be cured. In fact, to wish his good. That is what it meant in the Bible by loving him. Wishing his good, and not feeling fond of him, not saying he is nice when he is not.
Good. Does that help? Anyone? That last little bit? That's what it means to love them. Wishing him good.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to feel fond of him. You don't have to say he's nice. Just wish him good.
And what Lewis says also about we should not give in to the feelings of retribution, of getting our pound out of flesh out of that person, because the courts are supposed to be fair in administering justice, not seeking revenge, but instead, if someone is robbed a bank, well, then they go to prison for a certain number of years because they robbed the bank.
When we're told to pray for our enemies, bless those that persecute us, that's hard. That's hard, especially if they're still just continuing to do it, and you have to say, Lord, bless this guy. Yeah, I'm like Lewis. Lewis said he had to work a long time, and then suddenly one day it just happened. He realized that he had forgiven someone, and I understand that. I have one particular person that I continue to have to submit about, because I've realized that it's a problem, and years later I'm still dealing with that.
Okay, Barry, I forgive you.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. Appreciate it. I love you,
I thought
brother.
he was talking about me.
I'm sorry. Everybody said the same thing. Okay, I don't know what to say. Even John typed that in. Sorry, it was me. But yeah, I mean, it is good to hear. It is good to know that that's the prayer. It's hard, but that's the prayer. To say, bless that guy, Lord. And you don't know if that blessing, what that blessing will look like, but it's our duty to pray for that.
Well,
And Lewis,
Lewis
Go
was
ahead.
talking about his headmaster when he was a kid.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. You know, there is one aspect of this that we have just barely touched on, and that is we talk about, you know, you don't hate the enemy soldier on the other side. And because, I mean, how can you really hate him? You don't know him. But what if you run into a case where, for example, you are face to face with Joseph Mengele? What if someone had come face to face with Joseph Mengele, knowing all that he had done, and the desire to hate him would be almost overwhelming? And yet, we're commanded not to, even in his case. We are to wish that in this life or another he might be cured. This is not an easy task and an easy faith that has selected us.
You know, when Charles, prison ministry,
Colson.
Colson was on 60 Minutes. They got letters saying stuff like, if Charles Colson is in heaven, I don't want to be there, and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, you are really putting yourself in a lot of danger there.
Yeah.
My first thought when I hear something like that is, well, that's okay, because if that's the way you feel, you probably won't be.
Well, well, okay. Last paragraph. Hey, we're going to make it with a little overtime.
Unbelievable.
Somebody else want to, who hadn't read it wants to?
I'll read.
Okay. Marion. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I admit that this means loving people who have nothing lovable about them, but then has oneself anything lovable about it. You love it simply because it is yourself. God intends us to love all selves in the same way and for the same reason, but he has given us the sum ready. He has given us the sum ready worked out in our own case to show us how it works. We have then to go on and apply the rule to all the other selves. Perhaps it makes it easier if we remember that that is how he loves us, not for any nice, attractive qualities we think we have, but just because we are the things called selves. For really, there is nothing else in us to love. Creatures like us who actually find hatred such a pleasure that to give it up is like giving up beer or tobacco.
Oh, you gotta love Lewis.
You do.
Beer and tobacco. That's it. Okay, I'll have to admit that this is the first time that's caught my eye in that way. He's already given us the sum ready worked out on our own case. That's good. That's good. You don't know how it works? Well, take a look. That's what I did.
Mm-hmm. You know, the last sentence there where he talks about beer and tobacco, or somewhere, I think it was in the early to mid 50s, maybe early 60s. I don't remember for sure. But Bob Jones Jr. of Bob Jones University went to England and met Lewis. And after he came back, he was being interviewed by a member of the Billy Graham staff and asked his impressions. And he was silent for a minute. And then he said, you know, that man smokes tobacco and drinks liquor, but I do believe he is a Christian.
All right. Any other comments about last paragraph? All right. There we go. One more down. Next month, we will be reading the next sermon. You can go ahead and take a look at it. It's in the book, The Weight of Glory. And it is a slip of the tongue. A slip of the tongue. That's our discussion for November 12th. And we will be back together. So y'all have a good week, a good month. Take a look at all the stuff we've got going on. I'll have this, try to have this posted soon. If all things work well between us and YouTube, have it posted soon, and people who missed the meeting can perhaps see it. So,
Yeah, how many of the monthly meetings do we actually have recorded so far, Barry? Do you know?
this is number 3.
This is only the third one we've actually done?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I was thinking we had more, at least pieces of more. And so I was trying to find where I'd gotten them and I couldn't. So I began to realize I was wrong.
Yeah. So this is, I'm pretty sure this is the third one. And I'll try to get it up sometime early part of this week. So take a look at it, especially if you want to rehash some of the things that was said and give you some more thought about it. Anything else for the good of the group before we call it a night?
I have a question for the people from New York. I'm just sitting here realizing that their meeting was Friday night, and I meant to listen to that. And do y'all record those meetings? Charles,
yeah.
William.
Are they still with us?
Yeah, they're still here.
Yeah, okay.
I think so. I don't know where they're posted if they are. Bill might.
I do, because I've had to request a couple of them when I've missed that I particularly wanted to see. You can go to the website and there's a section called, I think it's in the section of meetings, but it'll give you the address somewhere of who you can write to request access to a particular meeting that was held. And Janet, I'll go to their website when I can and try to get more information for you.
Okay.
Well, I think they've recorded some of them because we've been doing them Zoom for the last year, but I don't know if they've posted them online anywhere.
They're in an archive on the website itself.
Okay.
And they're not readily accessible. You can't just go to it and look them up. You've got to be given a key to get to it.
All righty. Thank you.
All right. Anything else? Thank you so much for checking in tonight, and we will see you in November. All right. Blessings, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.